Where do I? Good morning, everyone. Where do I stick my thumb drive? Dean, Head of Department, Mr. Hanan, colleagues, students, members of the public. Oh, I'm not talking loudly enough? Oh, you're not hearing me? Oh, my bad. Are hearing me? Okay, better now? All right. Okay. Let me improve that. Okay. All right, let me start again. I think the dean has left, so it's now the head of department, Mr. Hanan. Colleagues, I see my colleague from the Translators and Interpreters Association here. Um, I see my colleagues from UTEC, Dr. Telfer, Mr. Cook, Dr. Farquharson. Thank you very much for the invitation. In the names of Louise Bennett, Beryl Loftman Bailey, and all the ancestors, I welcome you. All right, so just to correct a bit of false advertising by Dr. Farquharson, I'm not talking about translanguaging. I don't know where he got that from. That was not our discussion at all. So the title of my presentation is actually on screen, and I think it fits very nicely where it does, given what Dr. Walters spoke about. Of course, it's a very hard act to follow Dr. Walters, but we will try. All right, so where I'm going to go with my engagement this morning is to look at the education system slightly, obliquely, then look at how we as translators and interpreters to a certain extent, but mostly translators, are able to contribute to the resource question that Dr. Walters raised at the end of her presentation, because that is one of the big gaps in this entire process. Where I'm going to begin is to look at where the language debate has been in Jamaica and to see how we can help to shift it, because that's what needs to happen. Discursively, we have to move the debate from the English versus Jamaican Creole, where it has been stuck for a very long time, too long, because that is not very productive. The performance for students in English has really been driving a lot of the concern about language here. But we know, as Dr. Milson White has said, that the language situation of the country reflects a complex relationship between the two things, English and Jamaican Creole. And of course, we've had, as Patrick points out in a number of his works, the tendency has been towards some kind of what I call mesolectalism, where we have mixture between English and Jamaican Creole dominating, and as Patrick would indicate, this is a set of varieties that dominate in urban spaces. Now, put in all of that mix, this discussion that has been going on for quite some time about making Spanish the second official language, and how does that fit into the entire discussion? So where we have English as the official language of the country, de facto, not so de jure, it's used for business, it's used for instructions, it is also studied as a subject in schools. That becomes one part of the situation. But given what we all know, the performance in English has typically not been as it should be expected. And the country, given its Creole history, its background, has focused a lot on this as the problem. And then, of course, when you put the foreign languages into the mix, we don't have a lot of work going on into the teaching of foreign languages. The work is there, but it is sporadic, and it's not consistent. So I'm not going to focus heavily on that. There is quite a bit of work on the Jamaican language situation, as Dr. Milson White would have indicated at the start. And of course, there are intervention strategies, including work that she has been doing. And we are doing some work at UTEC, Dr. Telfo, on the foreign language situation in the country. To segue a bit from that now, that the language as problem approach has been the biggest humbug in relation to our ability to engage how we treat with Jamaican Creole, how we treat with English, and how we treat with the learning of foreign languages. As someone who speaks Jamaican Creole, English, and other languages, I see the problem slightly differently. I don't see there being any kind of challenge between English and Jamaican Creole first, but then having learned Spanish and French along the way, and a few other things which I speak conversationally, you wonder why we've been stuck at this place of seeing the language as problem, as our complete orientation. So we have to shift that perspective to language as resource now. Yeah? I didn't realize that you were there, Dr. Walters, directly in front of me. Language as resource. And to expand the discussion to look at the learner and the learner's repertoire. Now, there has been a discussion that has been going on since the early part of the 2000s, particularly among the Europeans, and their look at minority languages in places like the French territories in the Caribbean, as well as the languages that were formerly suppressed in Europe, Catalan in Spain, Euskara, the Basque territory, and other languages in places like France and so on, Corsican and those languages. So the Europeans have focused on a way of engaging language that speaks to the linguistic repertoire of the learner, and using that repertoire as a basis for engaging a number of social issues. So it's not just about the teaching of the language for economic purposes, but who the learner is as a human being. So there's a rights component, but it doesn't focus completely on rights. It focuses on the value of the person and the value of the language that that person comes into the classroom with. So I'm going to twin that with some historical data on the role of translation in that entire process, because translation as a practice and as a process, so while you are translating the kinds of things that you do, those elements, those factors can come together to benefit an entire language ecology like the one that we have in Jamaica that needs help in getting beyond the questions that we have been focusing on all this time. So there are two main things that translation can do that I'm going to be focusing on. Those are not the only things, but because of the time constraints, those are the ones I'm going to focus on. Expanding the use and development of Jamaican Creole. So again, going back to what Dr. Walters had mentioned, the need for resources, and placing it within this plurilingual education framework. And now there has been work done in Canada about how that can be done. So Dr. Davy, I think she's at McGill. She was writing the west of Canada, but I think she's now at the University of McGill. So she has done some work on that. And Dr. Nero, who spoke here a few months ago, Dr. Farquharson, she was your guest here some time ago. Well, okay, all right. Right. She's also doing some of that work. So they're pulling together the theoretical framework on the plurilingual approach to the engagement of language, the language learner, and seeing how that can be applied to the Jamaican language context. I'm going to backtrack a little bit, going to something the Prime Minister had said, and to look at one of the reasons why we need to actually move away from this language as problem kind of orientation. Because it doesn't only prevent us from moving forward, it reflects a certain kind of anxiety that we all have in this Creole society. So the Prime Minister is reported to have said, we need to ensure that we protect the English language in our country as discrete from our Jamaican language, which we must speak as we will and as we want, but get over this nonsense that one is going to block you from access in this society. You know, the assumption is that that one that he's talking about is the English, right? And one wonders whether English needs protection in the Jamaican context. You see? So that kind of framework reflects the historical anxieties typical in Creolophone societies like ours. And of course, it's about the fulfilling of certain kinds of aspirations associated with competence in the colonially inherited language. And the pressure that people like Dr. Farquharson and Dr. Walters have been putting on the system about granting recognition to Jamaican Creole, those are some of the reasons that we're seeing these kinds of defensive postures. So it's not any longer about the fact that Jamaican Creole can't do X or won't do X. It's about now we need to protect English because these fighters have come and they've surrounded us, and we need now to protect this language, which is a global language, which is used by vast majority of people all across the globe. And of course, the performance in English, again, driving that debate. So I spoke about some of this just now, so I'm going to skip this so we can move forward. Looking at the plurilingual education agenda, and that focus now being different from the one that I showed you earlier. The individual, oh, my apologies, I didn't even realize that was happening. My apologies. The repertoire of the individual. So the student who comes in front of you does not come as a blank slate. That student comes with resources. And to the extent that you deny that that student has resources and that those resources come in a language, perhaps not the one that you're instructing him or her in, is a problem in our context. So for us to deal with that challenge, you have to build the worth of the language. And to do that, you also have to think about a future projection, some projection into the future, which is how do you extend the student's repertoire. So the student comes with skills. Your job as a teacher is looking at how that student's repertoire can be expanded. Part of what Professor Devonish would talk about quite frequently to us, the subtractive bilingualism approach that many of us take to the teaching of language in the Jamaican context. The inverse of that is the valorizing of linguistic diversity. And we have to begin that discussion with the first language of the space in which we are operating, so strengthening intercultural competence. So rather than the perceptions of language as being impoverished, that there's a poor image given by the language and it is not useful or incapable of doing certain kinds of things, it doesn't have the expressive capacity, and it is not really a language because it's not written traditionally. It has low status because it has a small number of speakers. All of these are the arguments that have been presented, not just in the Jamaican context, but elsewhere where you have these kinds of minoritized languages. So the resourcing of languages now as part of the solution to these problems, and we know that, and Dr. Walters in language planning would understand that it's a very difficult task, uphill task, even where you are attempting to build the resource base of the language, you have all the social dynamics to engage. So there is the need for material, so instructional material, training material, reading material, entertainment material, because you're talking also about culture. The professional engagement, so linguistic and sociolinguistic material, the orientation and attitude of the people that are being engaged in the process, as well as their level of competence, their level of knowledge of the language is vitally important. Now, translation has typically played a very important role in the evolution of languages. And to narrow it a little bit, I want to focus on Martin Luther, the translator of the Bible into German. So where there is no written norm, and it's not that there is no written norm in quotation marks for us, there is a writing system that we are attempting to normalize, translation becomes a mechanism through which that happens. So you do get with translation the establishment of a reference, so you can refer to this text, right? And that's what happened with Martin Luther and the Germans. So we do have a model to look at. There is the stability of the textual form that comes with translation. And within the education system, because of how education works, and it's a kind of symbiotic relationship. So education relies on these normalized texts, but all of this happened partly because you had mass education. So the more you have mass education, the more you need these normalized texts. So there is that toing and froing relationship between the two. And of course, specifically for translation, the establishment of textual equivalents across codes. And the more you do that, the more codes you're establishing equivalents with, it means that you have more resources to pull on. So you can short circuit certain kinds of systems because you're now interacting not with one language and not simply with one mode of engagement, which is the oral mode. You've entered your texts into a network of communication with other languages. So just like the translation of Alice in Wonderland into Jamaican Creole, for instance, that text enters into a translational network with many other languages. You've translated the Bible into Jamaican Creole. It enters a network of biblical translations. And so all of the work, so quite a bit of the work that Dr. Farkas and I do, we are able then to look at how translations have been done across different languages, to be able to make certain kinds of choices when we are working together. I'm going to skip that because of time. Don't need to go into those details. No. Let's go to the actual work. So having established a process of engaging the language and the text that you have, how does that benefit you? How does that work? I'm going to give you two sets of examples that we worked on. Well, the resolution from the Kingston and St. Andrew, Municipal Corporation, right? A resolution that was being drafted on the Jamaican language, and that the Jamaican language unit and myself attempted to bang out a translation for. Now, won't go into the details of the translation process, but we do have a number of projects that we have been working on. One of them involves the strengthening of terminology in the language, and part of that comes from the translation processes that we engage in. So this text, the resolution, and similar to what Dr. Walters would have had to go through, you then are forced to determine what do I do when I meet upon certain kinds of textual challenges? And that resolution, the resolution of those challenges, becomes now the possibilities that other people are able to look at, they can test, and of course, they can choose to go with or reject. And that process becomes now the kind of expansion that you would want for the language through translation. You follow? So resolution, for instance, there are options, there are multiple options that we could have gone for, including the changing of the phonology of the English word. Didn't go for that, went for call for vote. And of course, looking at the structure of the Jamaican language, again, you would have seen some of that in what Dr. Walters presented earlier. How do you structure this kind of text in the Jamaican language as opposed to how it would have been structured in English? Now, something else then gets achieved in this process, which is important, going back to the language as problem question that we have been focusing on. The more of these kinds of resources that you provide and the more networks you have of the language in translation and the more textual material you have of the language, the more you have a separation of English from Jamaican Creole, discursively. So the kind of confusion that the draft language policy talks about and focuses on, you begin to address that concern by having documents, by having material in the language through translation. I'll give you another option. Oh, this one is too much. Oh yes, this one is nice. Can you see it? All right. You can't? No, I can't. All right, let me find another. Let's use this one. You can see this one? No? Ah. Okay. All right. So let me read the bottom for you. So the top says, and whereas the Jamaican language is a marker of unity and identity in Jamaican diaspora communities in Britain, Canada, and the USA, and elsewhere. So what we went for, and we had a lot of discussion, Professor Devonish, you remember, I don't know if you remember, the Juto, right? Okay. So our choice, and Juto, the Jamaican language, and well, this, the one versus one, I think there has been a shift there, but we went for, I want sign for sure, say, the Jamaican people, them in a Britain, Canada, America, and other else place, are one and can sure say them are Jamaican. That's a little complicated, but the critical area that we're focusing on is the transition between the segments and the whereas. So the Juto is what we went for, because when you look at how documents, legal documents are rendered, you want to have options, but not just options. You want to present a case, plant your flag, and then have people come and look, say, all right, I will own this, yes, sir. You understand me? Now, experts like Professor Devonish kind of disagreed with us, but I think the Juto, it is standing, our flag is standing. I think Sieka? Okay. Yeah. Now, when I engaged my students about this, Juto is preferred by the students because this is their language. You follow? So even after we had that discussion, Professor Devonish, when I spoke to my students, this comes off to them as something that they understand better than the Sieka. Yeah, it's more authentic for them. And you see, these students here are saying the same thing. So, go ahead, go ahead. Yes. Okay. All right. So, okay. So those are some of the questions that one would have to engage. All right. I'm going to move on. So now, in terms of resourcing the language, you clearly are going to need original material. Yeah. But that takes a long time to produce. Translation provides a shortcut. It short circuits the process because you are entering into networks that give you access to material that already exists. And it gives you a wider pool from which to draw for the material that you have. And of course, it provides support to the language planning and policy development processes. Conclusion, the quality of first language input, given the plurilingual option that I spoke about, has an impact on the learning of subsequent languages. So if you're talking about the learning of Jamaican, of English, sorry, of English or Spanish or French, you can't do that without an engagement of Jamaican. It can't simply be that our engagement with the language problem is about the learning of English. The sum total of everything is about learning English. The skills acquired in your first language can be transferred to subsequent languages. So the assumption that all the skills that you ever need in language reside in this one thing that many of us don't already speak is a problem. But beyond that, formalizing the resourcing of the first language, which really is the issue that people have not engaged. It's the formalizing of those resources, which translation can help to do, that we need to begin to talk about. Because once you formalize those resources, you provide better resourcing of the language, you're able to provide better skills, not just in Jamaican Creole, but also in English, and of course, when you want them to get to talk about Spanish. The deficit model of the language problem in Jamaica not only devalues the language, but by implication, it devalues the speakers of the language. And that is one of the biggest issues that we need to engage in this country. Thank you, thanks, merci, gracias.